Hi guys, welcome back. So what I'm going to be doing today for Learning Outcome 4, we are going to be discussing the tropes and themes that are discussed in MAUS that resonate with postmodernism most clearly. It's quite important for this section that you have gone through the reading. It's the contextual reading on VC Learn. So please make sure that you do go through it. It is very useful, it's very helpful for you guys, and it will definitely make sure that you have a good understanding of what I'm going to be discussing now. So everything I'm doing now is pulled out of there. So the first thing to keep in mind when we talk about tropes and themes is the difference between them. I know you guys have done this quite a lot first, second, and third year, but just as a gentle reminder, a trope is something that is a consistent either image or presence throughout a text. So for example, if you have certain interactions between characters that are quite repetitive, certain visual descriptions that are very present. So for example, a trope in modernism, in postmodernism, in MAUS might be the presence of the swastika, which might not be overtly in every single page, but it will possibly find its way there. So the symbolism is very important, and that would be a trope. Themes are more sort of the pervasive ideas that underpin the entire narrative, and a lot of the time they have to do with the ideas and the feeling and the content that the author will want you to take away with you once you have finished reading. So the first thing that is quite heavily talked about both in the reading and in general in the text is truth versus subjectivity. And in fact, this is something that Spiegelman himself suffers with. He struggles with the difference between how to represent something as complex as the Holocaust through art, but he also struggles intensively with how to represent himself as a person, as well as his father as a person, and how they have gone through such different experiences, but are united through the trauma that they have, particularly his father Vladek has experienced. The picture that I have chosen here, in fact, you guys will have done an activity on this in your slides for Learning of Outcome 1, and you will have seen the picture of Spiegelman sitting at his desk with all the dead bodies. These are the 4 that precede that. And what they are is him talking through the difference between how time has passed since the beginning of him writing this story down and translating it into a comic or graphic novel, as well as the experiences in contrast that his father went through. So just taking a quick read through. Vladek died of congestive heart failure on August 18th, 1982. Charles and I stayed with him in the Catskills back in August of 1979. Vladek started working as a tin man in Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. I started working on this page at the very end of February 1987. In May of 1987, Francoise and I are expecting a baby. Between the 16th of May 1944 and May 24th, 1944, over 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz. In September 1988, after 8 years of work, the first part of MAUS was published. It was a critical and commercial success. Now, this is just a list of dates and events that are happening and contrasting Vladek and Art's life, which seems a bit at odds with one another. And particularly if you take it further to seeing the next image, which goes directly underneath this, which is him perceiving himself to be on the dead bodies of the Auschwitz murdered Jews. What you need to understand here is he is listing a series of events that had grave importance on him and his father's lives, and yet how contrapuntal they are. Contrapuntal means things that seem completely different into one another. But when put in contrast to one another, you see something that they both either have in common or something that reflects and shines out of them. And therefore, you need to see them in contrast to one another. And what we see here is exactly that. We see the difference between their 2 lives. And in this moment, what we're supposed to see is Art Spiegelman's guilt. His devastating guilt at the fact that he has turned the survival story of his father, which he tries to write as a long-standing narrative to explain the trauma of what happened and how that trauma is pervasive in modern-day life, even 40 years later in a different country, speaking a different language. And although he is trying to do this, he is still earning a lot of financial and commercial success out of this. Not only is he sort of revered as one of the great artists of this period, particularly for graphic novels, but he's also revered as an activist, and he's financially done very well out of this work. And that lays very heavy on his shoulders. He has turned his father's trauma into something that is financially benefiting him. And in this moment, as an artist, he struggles to compare the traumas of his father's life versus the success of his own through that trauma. And so, how is he genuinely telling the story with truth versus his own subjective experience? And this is something that Spiegelman suffers through for the entire time. While he's constructing this narrative, is how true is he being, how honest is he being, and yet how much is he affecting he himself as the author? How is that affecting him, and how is this text a reflection of his own experiences? So what he's to take that a step further, Spiegelman here spends a great deal of time struggling to capture his father. And here you have two of these quotes, which is exactly that. I mean, here at the bottom, if you look at this image, you have Art talking again to Marla, who is his stepmother, where he says, I mean, I'm just trying to portray my father accurately. And here Marla says, even for himself, he won't spend any money. And here leads into the next thing, which is that scene that we saw earlier, where Marla is saying he has more love for things than for people. And if you have this in contrast, you have Françoise, she's always wearing this stripy shirt to represent who she is, where you have Art wearing always the waistcoat, and Vladek is wearing the glasses, Marla is always wearing the necklace with the black shirt. Quite important to be able to identify the different characters because they don't have specific facial features. And here you have Art saying, I mean, I can't even make any sense out of the relationship with my father. How am I supposed to make any sense out of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust? And here what he's saying is, can he capture his father's story and his own with honor, dignity, and sufficient complexity without muddying the waters? And one of the things he worries about, though doesn't necessarily articulate, is how is his negative relationship, which a lot of the time his relationship with it is very negative, how is that affecting his portrayal of the events? Is he doing a good enough job? And is he understanding his father's experiences? Or is he writing them off as just another survivor's trauma? So what Spiegelman in this moment is trying to say here is that, is there any truth to be recorded? Or is the best that he is capable of doing writing his own experiences and trying to do it with authenticity, not necessarily originality, but authenticity? And if he does do that with authenticity, isn't that truth? And although it is subjective, even though it might not be the actual factual truth. So here, one of the things, the next thing that this text does in general here is the whole of MAUS defies genre. And it defies genre, but it also defies form. When we look at a piece of text, a lot of the time we like to divide texts, films, books, musics into genre. I mean, how many times do you think about asking a friend, so what music do you listen to? And you expect them to just name a specific genre of music, a specific type or category. And here what you have is MAUS is battling that. MAUS doesn't want to be categorized. It doesn't want to be limited to one genre. And that is something that postmodernism does consistently. It does not want to limit itself to one genre, because if it does limit itself to one genre, it's following the rules of everything that has come before it, and it doesn't want to do that. So here what you have here is how can you tell something as serious as the Holocaust with anthropomorphized mice in a comic book form? And this is something this is why MAUS sort of epitomizes postmodernism, because it's saying you can tell any story in any genre you like, because just because you're following a different genre and a different form doesn't necessarily mean that it lacks integrity or it lacks academic merit. So when we talk about genre and form, something to think about is that genres and forms tend to be paired. And if you follow a specific genre, you will often fall into a specific form. which is where MAUS doesn't want to. So I've put up two examples here, and they are hopefully, one is meant to make you chuckle a little bit. The first is that if you're looking at things like contemporary fiction or literary fiction, you will find that texts tend to follow that form. So I've got an example here of a 2019 book that was very successful called Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, and it is considered to be literary fiction. And it is incredibly heavy on imagery, and it discusses quite complex topics such as adoption, racial relations in suburbia, and where does modern America stand on multicultural families. As this is meant to be a genre that it clearly identifies with its form, it knows the form it wants to take, and it wants to replicate that form. And then you have, by contrast, a text like The Italian's Unexpected Baby by Hewitt, which is a modern Mills and Boon. And if you don't know what Mills and Boon is the predecessor to 50 Shades of Grey. And it is meant to be a genre that is all about very graphic and descriptive content that is bent on romance and smut. So smut being descriptions of sex. And the genre is meant to be satisfying for everyone at the end of the day. Everyone is supposed to get exactly what they want. So postmodernism doesn't like this. Postmodernism goes, why do we have to follow these forms? Why do we have to follow these rules? Are we bound into these rules, or can we battle against these rules and actually choose a new form and a new genre and not have to stick to them? And that's exactly what we're looking at with MAUS. MAUS is saying, I can tell the story of the Holocaust and the almost eradication of an entire racial, cultural, and religious group through a genre which is considered lowbrow in the form of comic books, but with a very heavy sort of set of tropes and themes. And this leads us into, from the discussion of genre, into the discussion of highbrow versus lowbrow arts. One of the greatest things that we struggle with, and sometimes we even today struggle to understand, is that texts have generally been classed into high versus lowbrow arts. So if you're looking at highbrow art is things like books that have won awards like a Pulitzer or a Man Booker Award. Anything that is considered to be critical or intellectually stimulating, or it is included in what we consider to be the canon. Now, the canon is generally a collection of works that is academically highly credited and celebrated, and often is taught at a university. And this is generally highbrow. If we're contrasting it to something lowbrow, lowbrow is something that we do for enjoyment's sake. And if we're looking at the text of MAUS, MAUS is kind of pulling from all sides. It's part of the canon because it is considered to be taught at universities and is considered a great piece of art, but it is intellectually stimulating. However, it is using the form of a graphic novel, which is lowbrow. It is considered to be used for entertainment value and not necessarily to be part of a field of literature that is meant to be celebrated and preserved for future generations to enjoy. And postmodernism wants to break it down, and it does this through bending genres, like we talked about before, but it also does this by mutating and mixing things together that we wouldn't have normally and instinctively mixed together before now. So postmodernism wants to say that a soapy like Days of Our Lives is just as good as a film like Parasite, which won an Oscar last year. And MAUS is a great example of a text that goes, I can do everything at once, and I can do it in any way that I want to. I don't have to follow the rules of what literature has decided is the best version for me. So my next question is, and this is a challenge to you about whether something is high or lowbrow art. And this is a question about, do you have any bias, and do you realize you have any bias? I put a bunch of pictures of films, musicians, and books on the next slide. Some of them you might not recognize, and that's perfectly okay. I'll talk you through each of them sort of recently. And I want you to think about whether you would consider them high or lowbrow, and I want you to think about whether that shows if you have a bias or not. So the first thing that I've got here is a YouTube channel. They jokingly call themselves the dads of the internet, but they are a group called the Try Guys, and they make generally funny videos, not prank videos, but funny videos. They want to make people laugh, and that's primarily their job. So my question is, and I'm using just a YouTube channel. You could use any YouTube channel you find, but generally YouTube is a good starting point. Can YouTube be highbrow? Can it be highbrow, or is it just used for entertainment? And I think that this is a very interesting conversation to have. The next one is Billie Eilish. She's just walked away with more Grammys than anybody has done in the last several decades, if I'm correct. She's the first person to do so in a long time. However, would you consider her highbrow or lowbrow? I have a book here called The Fifth Season by an author named N.K. Jemisin, and she writes what is called speculative fiction. It's a combination of fantasy and science fiction, and she is writing about a complex sort of discussion of where sort of mythology comes from, and possible discussions about slavery and faith. It's a very complex text. It's also won a Nebula and a Hugo, which are both awards for fantasy and science fiction texts. Is it highbrow? Is it lowbrow? The next thing I have here is a cover for the film Get Out, which is a horror film in which there's massive race relation discussions, and it really highlights the power, the disproportionate power associated with different racial groups and how that is exploited now. The next is a book called A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, and it is the history of the witnesses to the death of, oh, I can see his face now, and he sang Buffalo Soldier. But basically it records some of the historical events that ended or followed that time, and it is a retelling, so it is not a historical book in terms of it may use some historical facts, but it is not pure nonfiction. It is a retelling, and it has won the Man Booker Award. The next is La Boheme, which is a Puccini opera. Operas 90% of the time we consider to be highbrow. However, a highbrow, this may not have been highbrow when it was originally released, because Puccini was considered to be generally loud, sometimes over dramatic, and a lot of operas were considered to be almost like modern day soapies. So would it be considered highbrow now versus what highbrow was originally? And does the time lapse between when something is published and when something is celebrated, does that shift whether something is highbrow or lowbrow? That's a thought you guys can have. And lastly, I have Sizwe Banzi is Dead, which is a collaboration between a variety of the actors, I think including John Cunny and Athol Fugard as the director. And this was a play that was very much a opposition to apartheid, and it was a very politically timeless play. It is not something that is performed as much nowadays because it is not as much bound into its historical moment. So my question to you guys is, I want you to look at these and I want you to assess whether they are highbrow or lowbrow. And I want you to think about whether they may transcend those barriers. And what is it that we allow rules to make something to be considered highbrow or lowbrow? And tapping into that, how is MAUS as an example of a text that straddles the line of being highbrow and lowbrow simultaneously? I'm going to leave it there because we're going to tackle some of the other postmodern tropes just now, but this is something that I would hope that you ponder a little bit before we carry on to the next section. Okay, good luck, guys.